Ancient Egypt was dominated by a harsh and unforgiving climate. The relentless sun baked the land daily, with temperatures often soaring above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit during the peak of summer. Imagine stepping into this world without any modern amenities like air conditioning or even access to cool, clean water at the push of a button. The desert's heat was not only oppressive but unrelenting, as shade was scarce, and homes were designed to combat the heat as best as the time allowed, which often wasn't enough. Even at night, the relief was minimal. While temperatures could drop significantly, the drastic change from scorching days to cool nights could leave you vulnerable to illnesses. If you're used to the controlled climates of modern life, where a thermostat regulates comfort, the ancient climate would feel like stepping into a furnace during the day and into the chill of the desert at night. Furthermore, the heat wasn't just an inconvenience. It dictated every aspect of daily life. Laborers and farmers were forced to work in the early hours of the day to avoid the midday sun. But even then, exhaustion and heat stroke were common. Hydration was a constant concern, yet access to clean, safe water was far from guaranteed. Those who couldn't adapt or cope with the extreme temperatures would quickly succumb to the physical toll. For the unprepared, surviving in this environment would require not only physical endurance, but also a deep understanding of how to conserve energy, stay hydrated, and navigate the demands of living in such a relentless climate. Without these skills, your 24-hour stay in ancient Egypt would feel unbearably long and potentially life-threatening. Hygiene in ancient Egypt was vastly different from what we consider acceptable today. While the ancient Egyptians were relatively advanced for their time, their understanding of sanitation was primitive and left much to be desired. Public hygiene systems, as we know them, simply didn't exist. Waste disposal was often haphazard, with refuse and sewage discarded in open areas or into the Nile River, the primary source of water for drinking, cooking, and bathing. Bathrooms, if you could call them that, were rudimentary. In wealthier households, there were clay basins for washing. But for most of the population, hygiene rituals took place outdoors, often near communal water sources. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, they used a paste made of ash and animal fat. While it helped with basic cleaning, it was far from the antibacterial solutions we rely on today. The lack of effective waste management and clean water created an ideal breeding ground for disease. Infections, parasites, and waterborne illnesses like dysentery and cholera were common. Without modern plumbing or an understanding of germs, people often unknowingly spread diseases through contaminated water and food. Imagine trying to maintain your health in an environment where every sip of water or bite of food carried the risk of illness. Additionally, personal hygiene was complicated by the environment. The constant presence of sand and dust made cleanliness nearly impossible to maintain. Sand found its way into every crevice of life, in food, clothing, and living spaces, causing irritation, infections, and even long-term health issues like worn-down teeth. For someone accustomed to modern standards of cleanliness, the stark contrast would be overwhelming. With no access to antibacterial soap, clean water, or effective ways to treat infections, even a minor wound could turn life-threatening. Adjusting to these harsh conditions would be a challenge not just of willpower, but of sheer survival. A gamble with life and death. In ancient Egypt, medicine was a curious blend of rudimentary science, spiritual beliefs, and trial-and-error experimentation. While they were advanced for their time in some respects, such as performing surgeries and using natural remedies, their understanding of human anatomy and disease was severely limited compared to modern standards. For anyone accustomed to the safety net of contemporary healthcare, the experience of seeking medical treatment in ancient Egypt would be nothing short of terrifying. Illness and injury were viewed as both physical and spiritual afflictions. Many ailments were believed to result from the wrath of gods, curses, or the interference of malevolent spirits. As a result, treatments often included a mix of incantations, prayers, and offerings to appease the gods alongside physical remedies. Physicians, known as SWNW, often worked closely with priests, blurring the lines between medicine and religion. The remedies themselves were often crude and, at times, harmful. Ingredients ranged from the practical, such as honey, known for its antibacterial properties, to the bizarre, like crocodile dung or animal fat mixed with herbs. These concoctions were applied to wounds or ingested, with unpredictable results. While some natural treatments might have been mildly effective, others likely caused more harm than good. Surgery existed, but without anesthesia or antiseptics. Even simple procedures like lancing boils or setting fractures were excruciatingly painful and carried a high risk of infection. Tools were made of bronze, which was far from sterile, and the concept of germ theory was millennia away from being discovered. If you suffered from a deep wound or serious injury, the chances of survival were slim. Moreover, chronic conditions such as arthritis or dental problems were commonplace due to their hard, sand-laden diet and the physical toll of their lifestyle. However, there was no such thing as long-term care or pain management. Remedies for chronic pain or serious illnesses were limited to prayers and whatever rudimentary treatments were available. The lack of understanding about hygiene and sterilization compounded these issues. Even a minor infection could spiral into a life-threatening condition. Death during childbirth was common for both mothers and infants, with midwives relying on traditional practices that often did more harm than good. For a modern individual accustomed to antibiotics, antiseptics, and advanced medical care, even the smallest health issue in ancient Egypt could become catastrophic. The reliance on spiritual rituals and unscientific treatments would leave you feeling helpless and exposed to the full force of the ancient world's dangers. A daily struggle with monotony and malnutrition. The diet in ancient Egypt was both a reflection of the resources available and the social hierarchies that defined the civilization. While the Nile River provided fertile land for farming, ensuring the survival of the population, the average Egyptian's diet was far from the balanced and diverse meals we enjoy today. For most people, food was monotonous, gritty, and nutritionally insufficient by modern standards. The staple foods for the majority were bread and beer. Bread, made from emmer wheat or barley, was the cornerstone of every meal. However, the grinding process often introduced sand and grit into the flour. This abrasive addition led to dental problems, as the constant chewing of gritty bread wore down teeth, exposing nerves and causing chronic pain and infections. Despite this, bread remained essential because it was calorie-dense and relatively easy to produce. Beer, another staple, was not the clear, refined beverage we know today. It was a thick, porridge-like drink, often consumed unfiltered. While it provided hydration and nutrition, it lacked variety and was not particularly appetizing by modern standards. Beer was also a crucial source of calories and was safer to drink than water from the Nile, which was often contaminated. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and leeks were common among the lower classes, while fruits such as dates, figs, and pomegranates were occasional luxuries. Meat was a rarity for most people, reserved for the wealthy or for special occasions. Commoners might have eaten fish from the Nile, but even this wasn't guaranteed, especially during periods when fishing was restricted for religious reasons. Protein sources like legumes, lentils, and chickpeas were accessible, but they lacked the variety needed for a truly balanced diet. Dairy products such as milk and cheese were consumed sparingly, as they were prone to spoilage in the extreme heat. The reliance on a limited range of food items often led to deficiencies in essential nutrients. Spices and flavorings were minimal for the average person. Salt was used for preservation, and herbs like coriander and dill added some variety, but the concept of seasoned or diverse cuisine was largely absent. For the wealthy, banquets featured a wider array of dishes, including roasted meats, honey-sweetened pastries, and imported delicacies, but these luxuries were unattainable for the majority. The physical labor required for farming and construction demanded significant energy, but the available diet often fell short in providing the necessary nutrition. Malnutrition, anemia, and stunted growth were common consequences of the limited food options, combined with the ever-present risk of contamination, whether from unsanitary cooking conditions or tainted water. Eating in ancient Egypt was not just about sustenance, but also about survival. For a modern individual, used to supermarkets overflowing with fresh produce, meats, and international cuisines, the narrow, repetitive, and often gritty diet of ancient Egypt would quickly become a source of frustration and discomfort. A perilous dependence on the Nile. In ancient Egypt, water was the lifeblood of the civilization, but accessing clean, safe water was a constant struggle for the average person. The Nile River was the primary source of water for drinking, cooking, bathing, and irrigation, but its availability and quality were far from consistent or reliable. For someone from the modern world, where clean water flows freely from taps, navigating water scarcity in ancient Egypt would be a jarring and potentially life-threatening experience. The annual flooding of the Nile, known as the inundation, was critical for replenishing the fertile soil needed for farming, but it was also a double-edged sword. During the flood season, water levels could rise unpredictably, sometimes destroying homes, farms, and infrastructure. In years when the flooding was insufficient, droughts occurred, leading to widespread famine and a sharp decline in water availability. The people of ancient Egypt had no control over these natural cycles, making their survival heavily dependent on the whims of the river. Even when water was accessible, it wasn't always safe to consume. The Nile served as both a life-giving resource and a repository for waste. People bathed, washed clothes, and disposed of refuse in the river, contaminating the water with human and animal waste. The river also teemed with dangerous parasites such as schistosomes, which caused debilitating diseases like schistosomiasis. Drinking or bathing in untreated river water often led to severe gastrointestinal illnesses and chronic health problems. For the wealthy elite, access to cleaner water was more manageable. They had servants who fetched water from less contaminated sources or stored it in pottery jars to allow sediment to settle. However, for the common laborers and farmers who made up the majority of the population, there was little choice but to drink directly from the river or communal wells, which were often no better in terms of quality. Irrigation canals, while essential for agriculture, added another layer of complexity. These man-made waterways were stagnant breeding grounds for mosquitoes, increasing the risk of malaria. Farmers working in the fields or tending to irrigation systems were constantly exposed to these risks, with little to no effective means of protection. Beyond health risks, the sheer labor required to obtain and transport water added to the daily burden of survival. Water had to be hauled in heavy clay jars over long distances, often in the blistering heat, and stored in homes with no guarantee of freshness. This labor-intensive process was a daily reality for most Egyptians, consuming precious time and energy. For someone from the modern world, accustomed to an endless supply of purified water delivered conveniently to homes and workplaces, adapting to the challenges of water scarcity in ancient Egypt would be a monumental task. The constant struggle to secure safe water, combined with the health hazards posed by contamination, would make surviving even a single day a daunting challenge. A life predetermined by birth. In ancient Egypt, the rigid social hierarchy dictated every aspect of life, from the work you performed to the way you were treated in society. Unlike today's more fluid social systems, where upward mobility is possible, your position in ancient Egypt was largely determined by birth, and escaping your assigned role was almost impossible. For someone from a modern society that values individuality and the ability to shape one's destiny, adjusting to this unyielding structure would be nearly unthinkable. At the top of the hierarchy was the pharaoh, considered a living god and the supreme ruler of the land. Below the pharaoh were the priests, nobles, and high-ranking officials, who enjoyed lives of privilege, luxury, and power. They lived in grand homes, wore fine linen, and had access to the best food, education, and medical care available at the time. This elite class made up only a tiny fraction of the population. For the vast majority of people, farmers, laborers, and artisans, life was defined by hard work and servitude. Farmers, the backbone of the economy, were tied to the land, working tirelessly to grow crops like wheat and barley to support not only their families but also the state and its extensive bureaucracy. They were required to pay heavy taxes in the form of crops, leaving them with little surplus for themselves. A bad harvest could plunge an entire family into starvation or debt, with no safety nets to fall back on. Laborers and builders faced equally grueling lives. Many were conscripted to work on monumental projects like the pyramids or temples. While popular culture romanticizes these projects, they were brutal undertakings. Workers toiled under the scorching sun for hours on end, hauling massive stones and enduring strict oversight from supervisors. Injuries were common, and those unable to work were often replaced without hesitation. Artisans and craftsmen, while slightly better off than farmers and laborers, were still bound by their position in society. They specialized in creating tools, pottery, jewelry, or statues, but their work often went unrecognized as they labored in service of the elite. Despite their skill, they had little autonomy and limited opportunities to improve their status. Women, though holding certain rights in ancient Egypt, also faced limitations imposed by the social order. While some women could own property, run businesses, or even become pharaohs in rare cases, the vast majority were confined to domestic roles. Marriages were often arranged, and women were expected to dedicate themselves to managing households and raising children, with few opportunities for personal advancement. Slavery, while different from the more modern concept of chattel slavery, existed in ancient Egypt. Slaves were often prisoners of war or individuals who had fallen into debt. They worked in households, fields, or on construction projects with little to no personal freedom. Religious belief reinforced the rigidity of this hierarchy. The idea of Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance, encouraged people to accept their station in life as part of a divine plan. Challenging the system was not only difficult, but also seen as a disruption of this sacred order. For a modern individual, accustomed to notions of equality, personal freedom, and the possibility of social mobility, living under such a strict and immovable hierarchy would be stifling. The lack of choice in one's occupation, lifestyle, and future would feel suffocating, making survival in such a society not just physically challenging, but mentally and emotionally draining as well. A life of unrelenting hardship. For the average person in ancient Egypt, daily life was synonymous with hard labor. Whether you were a farmer, a laborer, or an artisan, the work was grueling, exhausting, and often dangerous. In a civilization that depended heavily on agriculture and monumental construction projects, the physical demands placed on the majority of the population were relentless. For someone from a modern era, where machines and technology often handle the heaviest tasks, the physical toll of ancient Egyptian labor would be nearly impossible to endure. Farmers, who made up the largest segment of the population, worked tirelessly to cultivate crops in the fertile lands along the Nile. The farming cycle was dictated by the annual flooding of the river, and every stage of the process required intense manual labor. Farmers plowed fields using primitive tools, sowed seeds by hand, and harvested crops under the blazing sun. Irrigation was another physically taxing task. Water had to be hauled manually from canals or the river to keep fields hydrated. This was backbreaking work, performed with rudimentary equipment and without the aid of modern machinery. During the inundation season, when the fields were flooded and agricultural work paused, many farmers were conscripted to work on state projects, including the construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids. While popular depictions often romanticize these massive construction efforts, the reality was far from glamorous. Workers were required to haul enormous limestone blocks, weighing several tons each, across vast distances. Ropes, sledges, and sheer human effort were the only tools available for these tasks. The workdays were long and punishing, often beginning at sunrise and lasting until the heat became unbearable in the afternoon. Breaks were minimal, and the diet provided to workers, typically bread, onions, and beer, offered just enough energy to sustain them through the day. Injuries were common, from crushed limbs to heat stroke, and medical care was rudimentary at best. Those who couldn't keep up with the physical demands were quickly replaced, with little regard for their well-being. Artisans and craftsmen, while not subjected to the same level of physical strain as farmers and laborers, still endured demanding workloads. Creating intricate carvings, statues, and jewelry required long hours of meticulous effort, often in poorly lit and stiflingly hot workshops. These workers were bound by the expectations of their patrons, usually the elite or the state, and had little control over their schedules or the conditions under which they worked. Even within the home, labor was unending. Women were responsible for grinding grain into flour, a task that involved hours of kneeling and using a heavy stone to crush grain against a grinding surface. This repetitive motion led to chronic joint pain and other physical ailments. Cooking, cleaning, and fetching water also required significant effort, with no modern conveniences to ease the burden. Religious and ceremonial labor added another layer of strain. Workers building temples or preparing for religious festivals were often subjected to strict timelines and had to adhere to complex rituals, adding mental stress to their physical exhaustion. The constant physical demands took a toll on the bodies of ancient Egyptians, as evidenced by skeletal remains showing signs of arthritis, malnutrition, and injuries from repetitive strain. Life expectancy for the average person was relatively short, with many succumbing to the physical hardships of their environment by their 30s or 40s. For a modern individual, used to the conveniences of technology and ergonomic tools, the relentless physical demands of ancient Egyptian life would be overwhelming. Without the strength, stamina, and resilience developed through years of such labor, surviving even a single day in this physically punishing environment would be a formidable challenge. A world without rights or fairness. In ancient Egypt, the justice system was deeply intertwined with the concept of Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and harmony. While this might sound idealistic in practice, the system was far from just or equitable, especially by modern standards. The law heavily favored the elite and those in power, leaving the average citizen vulnerable to harsh punishments, false accusations, and an absence of personal rights. For someone from a modern society that values fairness, due process, and individual freedoms, navigating the justice system of ancient Egypt would be both bewildering and terrifying. At the top of the legal hierarchy was the pharaoh, who was seen as the ultimate arbiter of justice. His decrees were considered divinely inspired and were absolute. Beneath him, officials and judges carried out the day-to-day administration of justice, often interpreting the law in ways that reinforced their own power and the rigid social hierarchy. There were no codified laws as we know them today. Instead, decisions were made based on precedent, tradition, and the perceived will of the gods. This lack of clear legal standards created a system ripe for bias and inconsistency. For the common people, access to justice was limited and fraught with risk. Complaints and disputes, such as those over land ownership, theft, or unpaid debts, were brought before local officials or scribes. These officials were often members of the elite class, and their judgments reflected the interests of the powerful rather than the common good. Bribery and corruption were rampant, and those without wealth or connections had little chance of receiving a fair hearing. Punishments for crimes were harsh and often disproportionate. Physical punishments, such as beatings, mutilations, or public humiliation, were common for minor offenses. For more serious crimes, such as murder or treason, penalties could include execution or exile. In some cases, entire families were punished for the actions of one member, reinforcing the idea that justice was about maintaining order rather than fairness. Imprisonment, as we think of it today, was not a standard punishment. Instead, offenders were often conscripted into forced labor, working on state projects or in mines under brutal conditions. These sentences were effectively death sentences for many, given the extreme physical toll of such labor. For those accused of crimes, there was no presumption of innocence. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, regardless of whether the accused was guilty. Witness testimony was valued, but it was often influenced by social standing or personal relationships. If you were falsely accused, your chances of proving your innocence were slim, especially if your accuser was of higher status. Women, despite having more rights in ancient Egypt than in many other ancient civilizations, were still at a disadvantage in legal matters. While they could own property, initiate divorces, and represent themselves in court, societal norms often worked against them. In disputes, especially those involving men, women's testimony was frequently given less weight. Religious beliefs also played a significant role in the justice system. Crimes were not just offenses against individuals, but also against Ma'at and the gods. This spiritual dimension added another layer of complexity, as offenders were often required to perform rituals, offer sacrifices, or face divine retribution. These practices blurred the lines between law and religion, making the justice system more about maintaining cosmic balance than protecting individual rights. For a modern individual, accustomed to legal systems with codified laws, impartial judges, and protections against cruel punishments, the justice system of ancient Egypt would feel alien and unjust. The lack of legal safeguards, combined with the ever-present threat of corruption and harsh punishments, would make navigating this system an overwhelming and deeply unsettling experience. Ancient Egypt, while one of the most powerful and enduring civilizations of the ancient world, was not immune to the constant threat of invasion. Positioned at the crossroads of Africa and the Middle East, Egypt's vast wealth and strategic location made it a target for foreign powers seeking to expand their territories. Throughout much of its history, the Egyptians had to constantly prepare for and defend against invasions by neighboring peoples, including the Hyksos, Nubians, Libyans, and later, the Assyrians, Persians, and Macedonians. For someone from a modern society accustomed to the stability of national borders and a relatively secure geopolitical landscape, the constant state of alert in ancient Egypt would be a harrowing and destabilizing experience. At any given time, the Egyptian people could find themselves caught in the middle of power struggles between neighboring kingdoms, forced to defend their borders, cities, and homes from encroaching armies. In times of war, the military became a central part of society. Soldiers, often conscripted from the lower classes, were trained to defend Egypt from external threats, but their lives were often fraught with danger and uncertainty. The Egyptian army, though powerful and highly organized in its own right, was not invincible. The threat of invasion was ever present, particularly from the east, where the powerful empires of the Near East were constantly expanding. The Hyksos, for example, invaded and ruled Egypt for over a century during the Second Intermediate Period, throwing the country into chaos and forcing the Egyptians to adapt their military strategies and weapons, such as introducing the chariot and bronze weapons. Throughout the New Kingdom, when Egypt reached its imperial peak, it was frequently involved in military campaigns in the Levant and Nubia, extending its control over vast territories. But this empire building came with its own dangers. Egypt's borders were always under threat from rebellious local rulers or rival empires, and the military had to be in a constant state of readiness. Soldiers could be called into action at any moment, and failure to defend Egypt's borders often resulted in harsh punishments, both for the soldiers and their communities. The fear of invasion was not limited to soldiers on the front lines. The people of Egypt, from the elite to the commoners, lived in a constant state of vulnerability. Fortresses and walls were built around important cities, such as Thebes and Memphis, to offer some protection, but these structures could only do so much. The Egyptians also fortified key strategic locations along trade routes to protect their economic interests. For the general populace, the specter of war meant the disruption of daily life. Farmers could find their fields ravaged by invading armies, and cities could be reduced to ruins by military conquest. When invasions occurred, the consequences were often catastrophic. Egypt's long history of foreign invasions, such as those by the Sea Peoples, the Assyrians, and the Persians, led to periods of occupation, plunder, and political instability. During these times, Egyptians would have been forced to endure the hardships of foreign rule, including higher taxes, forced labor, and the erosion of their cultural and religious practices. In many cases, the ruling elite would be replaced by foreign invaders, and the local population would be left to endure the harsh realities of life under occupation. Moreover, the risk of invasion also influenced the way the Egyptians approached their everyday lives. For example, the construction of massive tombs and temples, while symbolizing their religious beliefs and devotion to the gods, also served as a demonstration of their power and a deterrent to potential invaders. Pharaohs and elite citizens sought to ensure that their tombs and monuments would stand as symbols of Egypt's greatness long after their deaths, sending a message to would-be invaders about Egypt's resilience. The constant threat of invasion also played a role in Egypt's diplomatic strategies. Alliances were frequently forged with neighboring states to strengthen Egypt's defense, but these alliances were often fragile and could collapse at any time. Diplomacy and espionage were integral parts of the Egyptian state's military strategy, as rulers sought to prevent invasions by gaining intelligence on potential threats and negotiating peace or military support when necessary. For a modern individual accustomed to living in a relatively stable, secure environment, the ever-present possibility of invasion in ancient Egypt would have been a terrifying reality. The lack of reliable communication, the absence of modern military technology, and the constant need to be on alert for threats would have created an atmosphere of anxiety and unease that permeated every aspect of life. Surviving in such an environment would require not only physical endurance, but mental fortitude, as one's life could be disrupted or destroyed at any moment by the violence of war. A dominant force in daily life. Religion in ancient Egypt was not merely a spiritual practice. It was the very fabric of everyday existence. Every aspect of life, from birth to death, was governed by religious beliefs and rituals, and every natural occurrence, whether it was the flooding of the Nile or the rising of the sun, was seen as a manifestation of the divine. Ancient Egyptians believed that the gods and goddesses controlled all aspects of the natural world and human life, and that maintaining harmony with these deities was essential for survival. For someone from a modern world with scientific reasoning and secular governance, living in a society where the divine influenced every action and event would be both overwhelming and suffocating. The gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt were numerous, with each deity presiding over different aspects of life. At the top was Ra, the sun god, believed to journey across the sky in his solar bark each day, bringing light and warmth to the world. Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and Isis, his devoted wife, were central figures in Egyptian beliefs about life, death, and rebirth. The Egyptian pantheon was vast and included gods like Horus, the god of kingship, Anubis, the god of mummification, and Hathor, the goddess of love and music, among many others. Each god had specific temples, priests, and rituals dedicated to them. For Egyptians, the gods were not distant beings but active participants in their lives. One of the central concepts in Egyptian religion was Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice. The pharaoh, as the living god, was seen as the divine representative of Ma'at on earth, ensuring that the natural and social order was maintained. This belief system permeated all aspects of governance and daily life. It was the responsibility of every Egyptian to uphold Ma'at through their actions, ensuring harmony in both the spiritual and physical realms. Failing to do so was seen as a grave transgression that could lead to chaos, sickness, or even death. The practice of religion involved constant rituals and offerings to appease the gods. Priests, who were among the most powerful individuals in Egyptian society, played a critical role in maintaining these rituals. They would perform daily offerings of food, incense, and other items to the gods, seeking their favor and protection. The temples themselves were vast and ornate, with walls covered in elaborate carvings and inscriptions that told stories of divine intervention, royal decrees, and victories in battle. These temples were centers of religious life, where people came to pray, seek guidance, and participate in communal ceremonies. For the average Egyptian, the demands of religious observance were constant. Most people would have been involved in small-scale religious practices at home, such as making offerings to household gods or lighting incense to honor the deities. Festivals and holidays dedicated to specific gods were also common, and these events often involved large feasts, music, dancing, and the offering of sacrifices. However, these rituals were not just for personal or communal fulfillment. They were vital to maintaining the favor of the gods. If the rituals were neglected or performed incorrectly, it was believed that the gods would withdraw their protection, leading to disastrous consequences for both individuals and society as a whole. The concept of the afterlife was another crucial aspect of Egyptian religion. Egyptians believed that life continued after death in a realm known as the Field of Reeds, where the deceased would be judged by Osiris. The soul would face a trial where it would be weighed against the feather of Mot, symbolizing truth and justice. If the heart of the deceased was found to be pure, they would be allowed to enter the afterlife. If not, they would be devoured by the demon Ammit and cease to exist. To ensure a successful journey to the afterlife, elaborate burial rituals were performed, including mummification, the provision of grave goods, and the construction of grand tombs. Superstition also played a significant role in daily life. Many Egyptians believed in the power of amulets, charms, and magical incantations to protect them from evil forces and misfortune. These objects were worn or carried for protection, and magical texts were inscribed on tombs or personal items to ensure safety in the afterlife. For instance, the famous Book of the Dead was a guide to navigating the challenges of the afterlife, offering spells to help the deceased overcome obstacles and ensure a smooth passage to the next life. The belief in magic was deeply woven into Egyptian culture. Priests and magicians were often called upon to perform rituals to cure illness, ensure a good harvest, or bring victory in battle. Even ordinary individuals might engage in simple magical practices, like reciting spells or using charms to protect themselves or their families. The belief in the omnipresence of supernatural forces meant that there was little distinction between the magical and the mundane. For someone from a modern, rational society, the overwhelming influence of religion and superstition in every aspect of life would be difficult to comprehend. Every illness, natural disaster, or misfortune was interpreted as a sign from the gods, and every action was guided by a divine framework. The inability to separate the spiritual from the practical would be disorienting, and the constant pressure to live in accordance with divine would be both mentally exhausting and emotionally draining. With every aspect of life dictated by religious belief, survival would be as much about appeasing the gods as it would be about physical endurance. Survival in a world without modern medicine. Ancient Egypt, for all its marvels in engineering, architecture, and art, lacked the advanced medical knowledge and technologies that define modern healthcare. The medical practices of the time were a blend of rudimentary surgery, herbal remedies, and spiritual healing, often based more on superstition and religious beliefs than on scientific understanding. For someone from today's world, accustomed to antibiotics, advanced surgical procedures, and a deep understanding of the human body, surviving in ancient Egypt without the safety net of modern medicine would be an incredibly daunting challenge. The practice of medicine in ancient Egypt was largely the domain of priests who were trained in the art of healing, but also in magic and religion. Healing was seen as a sacred task that required not only knowledge of the human body and its ailments, but also a deep understanding of the divine and supernatural forces at play. The Egyptians believed that illness could be caused by many factors, some natural, some divine, and therefore, the treatment of illness was often intertwined with religious rituals. Healing gods like Imhotep were invoked to cure physical ailments, and spells were regularly used to combat disease or injury. The combination of practical medicine and magic made the treatment of diseases and injuries unpredictable and often ineffective. One of the most significant health risks in ancient Egypt was the lack of sanitation and hygiene. While the Nile River provided a source of fresh water, the ancient Egyptians did not have an understanding of bacteria or disease transmission. Water sources, especially in large cities, were often contaminated, and without modern plumbing or sanitation systems, waste was commonly discarded in open spaces, leading to unsanitary conditions. The risk of waterborne diseases such as dysentery, cholera, or typhoid was high, and the Egyptians had no way of identifying or combating these invisible threats. Malaria and schistosomiasis, both spread by insects, were also common in ancient Egyptian society due to the proximity of stagnant water, and there was no effective way to treat or prevent these diseases. In terms of medical treatment, Egyptian doctors had some understanding of anatomy and physiology, but it was rudimentary compared to modern standards. Mummification, the process of preserving the dead, provided some insight into the human body, but it was largely focused on the preservation of organs for the afterlife rather than any understanding of the body's function during life. Surgeons were skilled in basic procedures such as setting broken bones, stitching wounds, and performing simple dental work, but the tools they had available were primitive, and many medical procedures were dangerous or ineffective. For more serious illnesses, Egyptians relied heavily on herbal remedies, many of which were passed down through generations. Plants like garlic, aloe, and frankincense were used in various concoctions to treat everything from fevers to infections. While some of these remedies had real medicinal value, many were based on trial and error rather than any scientific understanding of chemistry or pharmacology. In some cases, medicinal plants were used in conjunction with spiritual practices, such as chanting, praying, or offering sacrifices to the gods, adding an element of superstition to medical care. One area where the Egyptians did excel was in the field of dentistry. They had an impressive knowledge of oral health, and archaeological evidence shows that they used crude dental tools to extract teeth, treat abscesses, and even create early forms of dental bridges and crowns. However, without access to modern dental materials and anesthesia, dental procedures were painful and often dangerous. The lack of antibiotics meant that infections could quickly become life-threatening, and even minor injuries could lead to serious complications. Childbirth was another perilous event in ancient Egypt. While women did have access to midwives who were trained in the art of delivering babies, the lack of sterile conditions and modern medical interventions made childbirth a risky endeavor. Maternal and infant mortality rates were high due to complications such as infections, hemorrhaging, and obstructed labor. Caesarean sections were sometimes performed, but the lack of anesthesia and surgical knowledge meant that the procedure was often fatal for both mother and child. For mental health, there were no therapies or medications like we have today. Egyptians believed that mental disorders could be caused by supernatural forces, such as possession by evil spirits, and treated these conditions with rituals and spells. Those suffering from mental health issues were often seen as being afflicted by the gods or demons, and treatments might involve prayers, offerings, or rituals designed to drive out the evil spirits. For those suffering from emotional trauma or psychological distress, the lack of therapeutic approaches would have made survival even more challenging, as mental health issues were largely misunderstood and stigmatized. In the event of injury or illness, there were no hospitals or clinics where a person could receive consistent care. The treatment of the sick or injured was typically handled by family members or local healers, and medical knowledge was often passed down informally through generations. For someone with a serious injury or illness, survival would depend largely on their own resilience and the effectiveness of the limited remedies available. Even minor injuries or infections, without the benefit of antibiotics, could result in death if left untreated. For a modern person, the lack of medical infrastructure and the absence of reliable, scientifically based treatments in ancient Egypt would pose an insurmountable challenge to survival. The constant risk of illness, combined with the primitive nature of medical care, meant that every injury or illness could quickly become life-threatening. A modern individual, reliant on access to hospitals, doctors, and pharmaceuticals, would find it difficult to navigate a world where medical knowledge was limited and often entwined with superstition. The lack of effective treatments for everything from infections to chronic conditions would mean that survival itself would be a fragile and uncertain endeavor. Inequality at its core. One of the most defining features of ancient Egyptian society was its rigid and unyielding social hierarchy. Unlike modern societies, which, despite the challenges of inequality, are built on the idea of individual rights and upward mobility, ancient Egypt was a world where one's place in society was largely determined by birth. The social structure was designed to maintain a clear divide between the elite and the masses, with the ruling class at the very top, followed by scribes, priests, artisans, and farmers. For someone from a modern world that values equality, social mobility, and individual rights, surviving in ancient Egypt would be an exercise in enduring a system of strict class divisions and limited opportunities for advancement. At the pinnacle of Egyptian society sat the pharaoh, the divine ruler, who was considered a living god. The pharaoh's role was to maintain Ma'at, or cosmic order, ensuring that the world and society functioned in harmony. Beneath the pharaoh were the nobility and high-ranking officials, many of whom were relatives or loyal servants of the pharaoh. These individuals had access to wealth, power, and land, and their lives were marked by luxury. They lived in large estates, had access to fine food and clothing, and enjoyed a level of privilege that few could even imagine. For someone born into this elite class, life would be relatively easy. One had the resources and social status to avoid the hardships that plagued the lower classes. However, for the vast majority of Egyptians, the situation was far from ideal. Beneath the nobility were the priests, who held a powerful position in Egyptian society. As intermediaries between the gods and the people, priests wielded considerable influence. They managed the temples, conducted religious rituals, and controlled the flow of religious knowledge. Their status was above that of the average citizen, but their power was still subordinate to the pharaoh and the nobility. Priests, like the nobility, enjoyed privileges such as land and wealth. They were often educated and had the means to live comfortably. However, their position was largely tied to their religious role, and their influence was dependent on the continued favor of the gods and the pharaoh. Below the priests were the scribes, those who could read and write in a society where literacy was incredibly rare. Scribes were responsible for recording everything from legal documents to religious texts to business transactions. As Egypt's bureaucratic system was highly organized and dependent on the accurate recording of information, scribes played a crucial role in maintaining order. While their lives were far more comfortable than those of farmers or laborers, their status was still below that of the nobility and priests. They could, however, achieve a degree of respect and influence that most people would never experience. They were highly educated and could hold administrative positions, but their social mobility was still limited by their lower status in the larger social structure. The majority of Egyptians, however, were peasants, farmers, and laborers. These individuals were the backbone of Egyptian society, yet they were at the very bottom of the social pyramid. The vast majority of Egyptians lived in rural villages, where they worked the land, tending to the crops that were essential for the survival of the kingdom. The Nile's annual flooding provided the water and nutrients needed for crops, but farming was hard, backbreaking work. Farmers and laborers had little control over their own lives and were subject to the demands of the elite. They worked long hours in the fields or on state-sponsored construction projects, often for little pay and under harsh conditions. Their lives were dictated by the whims of the pharaoh and the landowners. One of the most significant aspects of this harsh social hierarchy was the lack of opportunity for upward mobility. If you were born into a farming family, there was little chance of improving your status. The social system was designed to keep people in their place. If you were born a laborer, you would likely die a laborer. Education was reserved for the elite, and only the children of wealthy families could afford to be educated as scribes, priests, or other officials. Even if someone had the ability and desire to climb the social ladder, the barriers were nearly insurmountable. Slavery also played a role in Egypt's social hierarchy, though it was not as widespread as in some other ancient civilizations. Slaves were typically prisoners of war or individuals who had fallen into debt and were forced into servitude. They performed the most menial and grueling tasks, such as working in the fields, cleaning, or building monumental structures like temples and pyramids. Slaves had no rights and were considered property, not people. While they could sometimes earn their freedom, the vast majority of slaves would spend their entire lives in servitude, with no hope of ever improving their position. The disparity between the rich and the poor was stark, and the gap between the elite and the lower classes was a source of social tension. Yet, despite the inequality, the Egyptian social system was generally accepted by most of the population. The deeply ingrained belief in Ma'at, the divine order, meant that the social hierarchy was viewed as a natural cosmic arrangement. The gods, it was believed, had placed each person in their position, and any attempt to upset this order would lead to chaos and disorder. However, this belief in divine order did not mean that the lower classes had no agency. While the chances of rising in social rank were slim, they were not impossible. There were instances of peasants rising through the ranks, particularly through military service or by gaining favor with the pharaoh. However, these instances were rare, and the vast majority of Egyptians remained bound by their social roles. For someone from the modern world, where the ideals of equality, freedom, and meritocracy are held in high regard, surviving in ancient Egypt would mean enduring a society where your fate was largely sealed at birth. The lack of opportunity to change one's social status, combined with the oppressive nature of the class system, would be suffocating. The burden of being born into the lower classes, subjected to hard labor, poor living conditions, and limited rights, would make survival not just physically challenging but also emotionally and mentally exhausting. In such a society, individual identity and aspirations would be subordinate to the demands of the state and the rigid, unchangeable social structure. In conclusion, surviving even a single day in ancient Egypt would be a monumental challenge for anyone from the modern world. From the oppressive heat of the desert to the relentless demands of a rigid social hierarchy, from the constant threat of disease and injury to the lack of medical knowledge, life in ancient Egypt was unforgiving and harsh. Every aspect of daily existence, whether it was navigating religious rituals, defending against invasions, or simply trying to survive in a society where your place was determined by birth, would be a test of resilience, strength, and endurance. In ancient Egypt, survival was not just about physical stamina. It was about enduring a world filled with uncertainty, superstition, and inequality. The very systems that shaped the ancient world were designed to maintain order at the expense of the individual. In the face of such challenges, survival was not guaranteed, and the struggle for life was shaped by forces beyond one's control. While ancient Egypt produced extraordinary advancements in art, architecture, and culture, the daily lives of its people were marked by hardship and suffering. For anyone from a modern world accustomed to the comforts and conveniences we enjoy today, the reality of ancient Egyptian life would be a harsh and often insurmountable obstacle. But it was in these trials, in the endurance of hardship, that the strength of the Egyptian people can truly be seen, surviving not just the elements, but the complex, often unforgiving world they lived in.